Our first lecturer hails from my native country of the US of A, a professor of educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also serves as a board member of the International Forgiveness Institute. He is a pioneer in starting research on forgiveness within the social sciences. Please welcome Professor Robert Enright.
Thank you to all of you for being here, and I want to thank Bar-Ilan University for asking me to come. I am humbled to be able to share some ideas with you. As it says up here, I'm going to talk with you about forgiveness and prisons. And my ideas are very controversial. Some would say radical. My very first attempt at a grant on any subject connected with forgiveness was in 1985. So when I add that up quickly, that's over 30 years ago. And my thought was to help those imprisoned to forgive those who have hurt them so their anger would lower and they would not be so much of a threat in prison. The gentleman who interviewed me as part of the grants panel said, "This is great. I'm rating you #1 and you're going to get funding." And I thought, gee, this study of forgiveness is going to be easier than I thought. And 1 month later, I got the rejection letter saying, "We're not going to fund you." So I called up the gentleman who rated me #1 and said, "What happened?" And he said, "Professor Enright, you embarrassed me." I said, "How could I have possibly embarrassed you when you liked it so much?" And he said, "I got into the room of the other board members and I proudly presented your ideas, and after they got done laughing at the idea, they said, 'Give Enright money to help the prisoner forgive? Why, they should be seeking forgiveness from us. Rejected.'" It has never gotten any better. I have tried for 3 different grants at 3 different times over 30 years to try and help those imprisoned to forgive those who have hurt them, and I have been roundly rejected each time. But it has not stopped the idea. I am here today to share with you this rejected idea. I am here to share with you an idea that I think could change the face of corrections. We do not deal with restorative justice. Restorative justice primarily is about the forgiving of those who are victimized if they want to. But even in restorative justice, the idea of forgiving, and I agree with this, is controversial, because the victim should never be pressured to forgive. They have already been victimized. If we put pressure on them to forgive, we are victimizing them a second time. And I don't think we should do that. What my idea, my radical idea, consists of is prior to restorative justice. It's getting the one imprisoned to be ready to enter into dialogue with the one they have victimized by first dealing with their own issues prior to the crime, where they may have indeed been brutalized. I am not talking about all who are imprisoned. I am talking about a specific part of the population who have indeed been victimized by others prior to their victimizing. And those who have been so victimized, they are still carrying the anger with them into their crime and into their prison. I think corrections is missing a major point. And that major point is that many of those imprisoned are wounded. And they've been gravely wounded by others, and we ignore it. I don't want to ignore it any longer. All right? I'm tired of this idea being rejected, and I'd like to bring it forward into the correctional system. So here's where we're going in the next half hour or so. I want to make the claim that resentment or unhealthy anger can compromise the actual rehabilitation effort of those in prison. Without you and I being aware of the broken heart of those who are prisoners, we will get nowhere in their rehabilitation for those who have been wounded gravely by others. Forgiveness, working with the prisoners to help them forgive those who have hurt them, could be an avenue not only for healing of their heart, but safer prisons and safer environments once they get out of prison, and reduced recidivism rates, or going back into the prison. So I want to ask as one of my questions, what is forgiveness? What do we mean by that? It is woefully misunderstood in society. I have had the honor of being the first to publish empirical research on the topic of forgiveness. Many people thought I had lost my mind when I started studying the topic of forgiveness at a university. This is stupid. This is ridiculous. Why are you doing this? You are ruining your career, I was told. Maybe I have ruined my career. I don't know. We'll see. All right? Maybe I have. I want to share with you the scientific evidence that forgiving is beneficial, particularly for curing unhealthy anger. We're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about how we go about forgiving, and then the future of forgiveness within corrections, which obviously I would like to see. So let's take a look at our assumptions here. First of all, many imprisoned people, I claim, have been treated very deeply, unjustly, and unfairly by others prior to their crime. Rehabilitation and corrections likely will not be effective if we leave them with their broken hearts and their rage. Resentment can block their focus, their energy, and their cooperation in prison and with the rehabilitation process. Resentment can lead to displaced rage onto others, with self-interest, with assault, with murder, much of which has been born out of a very unjust trampling of their heart when they were 6-year-old, 8-year-old, or 16-year-old, and we're not aware of that. And we need to find a way to heal them, and I think forgiveness interventions is the way to do it. Let's start with a story. The incident of the father, the son, and the gravel driveway. We started a forgiveness group in what we call in the United States a maximum security prison. When we use the adjective maximum, we mean they've done very bad things. And this gentleman was in prison for life. He's not getting out because he's a mass murderer. He killed his whole family. Right? And when we started the group therapy on forgiveness, day one, the counselors asked each of the men in this highly secured facility, tell us your story of deep unfairness against you prior to your committing a crime. And this gentleman started to weep. He started to cry. And he had been in maximum security prison for 20 years. And the counselors were shocked. Here was a mass murderer, a tough guy, okay, who gave the officers a hard time in prison. He had a reputation, and here he was crying. And so the counselors asked, why are you crying? And he said, nobody has ever asked me this before. And he had been in prison for 20 years. "What is your story?" they asked. Here is his story. When he was a child, for his discipline from his father, whenever he misbehaved, his father would make him crawl on his hands and knees down the long gravel driveway to pick up the mail, the letters that were mailed, crawl back again, and then on his knees hand the mail to the father. And that happened over and over and over again when he was 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, until he was 16 years old, and he was strong enough to pick up his father's hunting rifle, and he shot the whole family, and they're now dead. Right? I do not condone mass murder, but I understand. I understand what happened to that young man. His heart was so brutalized by his own father that he developed a rage, a hatred that was never forgiven, that he never had a chance to get rid of that rage. Had that young man ever learned about forgiveness, he would not be in prison today, and his whole family would be alive. If the father had ever learned about forgiveness, and whatever happened to him in his life, I don't think he would have abused his son. And I think the son would have never had to crawl on his hands and knees over and over again and be humiliated and to develop a hatred in his heart. And the whole family would be alive today, and that man who was in prison for the rest of his life would have never been behind bars. This is a story of tragedy, because it could have and should have been avoided, and it wasn't, because no one thought about the idea of forgiveness. He is now in prison, and it's not too late for him, because he can at least get rid of the rage he has been carrying for 20 years in prison, and no one ever asked him about it. You see, in this particular prison, the more rage he shows, the deeper he goes into the prison, until he's in what we call restrictive housing, or what they used to call solitary confinement, on his own. The more rage he shows, the more isolated he becomes, and the more enraged he gets. But what about reversing that? What about changing that? The group forgiveness therapy was the beginning of that for him. Okay, so what's the evidence? That was just one story. Right? Well, what's some evidence that those who go into prison go there with prior treatment that is totally unreasonable, unfair, and damaging? A colleague of mine, Joseph Newman, from the University of Wisconsin, from where I come, did a study in what we call a medium security prison, not maximum. And they looked at 183 men, and all of them, without exception, every one of them, when they were given scales of oppression in childhood, all 183 had incidences of physical abuse, physical neglect, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, and sexual abuse against them. Right? Every one of them. We recently got done with a study with 85 men in a maximum security prison. They're the mass murderers. They're the ones who do very, very bad things in the Midwest of the United States. And of the 85 men, 90% of them, 9 out of 10, have had serious injustices against them prior to their crime, conviction, arrest, and imprisonment. And when we sit around, my graduate students and I, and look at their stories, because they have written them out for us, they would make you weep. Right? One man was thrown out of his house at 8 years old by his mother. Do you know what his bed was then for the next 5 years or so? His bed was sleeping under cars for protection. His dining room table was trash cans. He was totally rejected by his family, and the rage built up in him until he then put that rage onto others. Right? And so we have a problem. And when we go further into our data, we find that those who are not forgiving, those who have brutalized them in childhood, are the more angry, anxious, and depressed. Right? And doesn't it make sense? If you're carrying this brutality in your heart, and of these 85 men, most of them, when they were writing their stories of deep woe, would say, this is the first time I've ever telling anyone about it. And when I put myself into the shoes of the gentleman who was thrown out at age 8, and I think about my bed being under a car, and I think about my dining room table being a garbage can, I ask myself, how could I even be alive when he's 40 years old? How could I even be alive with never telling anybody about this? And not only do they not tell anyone about this, they carry the rage with them, and others become the victims of the rage. And the corrections aren't even aware of it. But as with the gentleman who's in for life because he shot his whole family, it's not that hard to ask this question: what happened to you? How long did it take me to get that out? All right? What happened to you? I think sometimes mental health professionals are afraid to ask that question because they don't know what to do about it. You see, the resentment is like a poison. It's like a disease. And if we don't have a cure for the disease, we ignore the disease. We've got a cure for the disease. The cure for the disease of resentment is called forgiveness. And the social sciences are just awakening to that. Unhealthy anger, resentment, this disease that can chip away at you, eat away at you, and end up eating away at others as you give your resentments to others, has been associated scientifically with increased anxiety, depression, addiction, oppositional, defiant behavior, and many other issues. If you look at the psychiatric literature, the idea of deep anger is not given the prominence it needs. In almost every one of the mental disorders, you will see elements of deep anger there that has not been brought forward yet by the psychiatric community. So, if the practice of forgiveness can help cure the disease of resentment, I want to prove that to you. Hold me to that. I don't want to just assert that. I want to prove it to you. All right? What do we mean by the term forgiveness? It's woefully misunderstood. All right? I have been talking to people all over the world for over 30 years, and most people who are in audiences like this define forgiveness as just moving on, getting over it, just letting it go. All right? But that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness first is a choice. That's why with restorative justice we should never make forgiving a requirement of the victim. Because forgiveness should not be a requirement. It's up to the one victimized to forgive or not. Right? Forgiveness is a moral virtue. Moral virtues deal with goodness. Justice is a moral virtue. It's the moral virtue of fairness between and among us. Patience is a moral virtue. Kindness is a moral virtue. So forgiveness is a moral virtue. What kind of a moral virtue is it? Basically, the short story of it is, forgiveness is always centered on unfairness and gasp, someone stop me please. The definition basically is being good to those who aren't good to you. Oh. No wonder I've been rejected in the grants. It seems so silly. It seems so ridiculous, especially when you put it alongside justice. Being good to those who aren't good to you? How stupid, how weak, how ridiculous. But it's not, right? Forgiveness cuts across every single philosophical and religious system I, in my imperfection, have been able to examine. And what I like about that is you can have an atheist, a humanist, an agnostic, a Muslim, a Christian, a Jewish person, a Baha'i, and a Hindu, and a Buddhist all together, and we can all agree, if we've studied the topic of forgiveness, that it is worthwhile. The ancient texts honor forgiveness. Right? And to show you the oldest preserved account of forgiveness that I have ever been able to find, and remember, I'm an egghead professor. I read everything I possibly can in English. This is the oldest. It's the Joseph story that appears in Genesis 37 to 45. You might want to take a look at it. It's the oldest preserved account of any detailed account of forgiving. And what's the story? You know it better than I. Joseph was the favored son. The 10 half-brothers were very jealous. They threw him down a well. That's injustice number one. They pulled him out, sold him into slavery. That's injustice number two. They all grew up. He was in power then in Egypt, and here come the 10 half-brothers. They don't recognize him. He recognizes them. So what does he do with regard to forgiveness? He throws them into prison. Right? He's not being good to them. But when he hears them lament, he weeps. That's the beginning of his softened heart. He keeps Simeon back because he wants them to go back to their land because he wants to see Benjamin, his full brother. And when he sees Benjamin, he weeps again. Right? But then what does he do? He plays a trick on Benjamin with the silver goblet and the knapsack. They're almost out of Egypt, and the soldiers come and accuse Benjamin of theft. And then comes Judah, who says, "Take me instead of Benjamin." And what happens with Joseph? He weeps a third time. And in his third weeping, he unconditionally, nobody said, "We're sorry." Nobody repented because they didn't know who he was. So this is a story of unconditional, no apology necessary, forgiveness toward his brother and half-brothers. And what did he do in his forgiving? He lavished love upon them, even though in terms of justice they did not deserve it. They brutalized him. They did not deserve goodness. And what does he do? He gives them animals. He gives them provisions. He gives them food. He helped save the Hebrew nation through his forgiving. Did you ever think of the Joseph story that way? That in his unconditional forgiving, he helped build up the Hebrew nation? That's how important forgiving is in the Hebrew scriptures. And did you know that there is a story in the Quran called Joseph? And it's very similar to this? Aha! We can sit down and talk peacefully together about Joseph and what he has done in his life. Right? My point is that this cuts across many, many different viewpoints. But those of you who are here in this particular part of the world have the ancient traditions in particular that we don't have in other parts of the world. You have a very special idea here, a very special challenge, that forgiveness was introduced to you by those who have come before you, far more than other parts of the world. Okay? So here's a formal definition of forgiving. 3 parts. First, we've been treated unjustly. Then we tried to get rid of resentment. We struggled deliberately to not hold resentment toward the one who hurt us. And here's where it gets controversial. You offer goodness of some kind just like Joseph did. A smile, a return text, a return phone call, something that is giving of yourself toward the one who was not giving to you. Forgiveness is not excusing. You don't say, oh, now that I forgive you, what happened to me is perfectly fine. No. When you forgive, I'm sure when Joseph forgave, he never said, oh, you throwing me down the well was fine, no problem. Or you throwing me into slavery, no big deal. I doubt it. I think he would have said what happened to him was unfair, is unfair, and will always be unfair. When we forgive, we don't excuse. We get very tough-minded about what happened to us. We get soft-hearted toward the one who hurt us, but very hard-headed regarding what happened to us. We don't forget. People say forgive and forget, but we never forgive the brutality against us. We just don't. We might remember in new ways, but we don't forget unless it happens again. We have to watch our back, you see. We don't just simply calm down when we forgive and say, peace and love, man, everything's fine. No, not at all, because you can calm down and still hate the person. You can calm down and still, once you come up again from your calm, you're in a rage. And forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. Reconciliation is a negotiation strategy of two or more people coming together again in mutual trust. Sometimes we have to forgive people without trusting them. As an example, we work a lot with abused women, okay? Sexually abused women. We have done that in the United States, we've done it in Pakistan, we've done it in different places. Some of the women, when we talk about forgiveness, look at us in horror and say, are you asking me to go back into that relationship again? And the answer is no, no, no. Because to forgive is to try and get rid of the negative, offer something positive even if it's from a distance, and it doesn't mean you come together again if you cannot trust the one who hurt you. The other's going to have to do a lot of changing for the two of you to get back together again. They have to establish trust. So this is a big issue that can divert many of the criticisms toward forgiveness. When you forgive, it's your call whether you reconcile or not. When you forgive, you may not reconcile. And this is another important one. When you forgive, you always bring justice with you. It's not either or. When you have empathy toward the one who hurt you, you can still call the police. Right? When you return the phone call and they have stolen from you, you can still ask for the money back. If someone deliberately scratches your car, you can ask them to pay for the repairs as you forgive. See, a lot of people dump on forgiveness when they think that if you forgive, you have to let go of all that has happened to you, and that is not the case. And we have done studies internationally. Our most recent ones are in Greece and Saudi Arabia. And we're all pretty much in agreement. There are nuanced cultural differences, but for the most part, when we forgive, we don't throw justice away. We may or may not reconcile, and we don't excuse the wrong. It is a moral virtue. We try to get rid of the negative and institute the positive. Okay, so what's the evidence? What's the scientific evidence? I'm a scientist. I study forgiveness. I don't just talk about it. What's the scientific evidence that forgiveness, in fact, works? We've done a lot of what we call randomized experimental and control group trials. One of the first ones was with incest survivors. And yeah, every one of them, all 12 of them, said to us, they were very kind. And when we suggested that we're doing an intervention on forgiveness, every one of them privately said to us, are you sure you want me in the study because I'm never going to forgive? And we said, yes, please come. And Suzanne Friedman did this study as part of her doctoral dissertation, and she worked one-on-one with 6 of the incest survivors, 1 hour a week for 14 months. The control group of 6 were free to seek therapy as they wished. They all came to us clinically depressed. At the end of the first 14 months, the experimental group, the 6 who had the intervention with Suzanne, once a week for 14 months, didn't just improve in depression, the depression left. The control group, who could do therapy any way they wished, outside of Suzanne Friedman's counsel, were still clinically depressed. They then started the forgiveness intervention, and after 14 months, they went to non-depressed status. And what of the first group? Now, 14 months later, after therapy ended, they were still non-depressed. They got their lives back by forgiving. One woman, who is Jewish, brought her 2 sons to the cemetery and had a tasteful Jewish ceremony of respect for the dead, not because of what the father did, but to give him a good name toward his grandchildren from the grave. Another woman fed her dying father in the hospital. She helped with his care. And she said, I'm very glad I helped, because when he died, not only would I have mourning, because after all he's my father, I would also have rage. Now I don't have both. The women were healed. We've worked in drug rehabilitation, and you know what happens when people learn to forgive those who've hurt them deeply when they're addicted to drugs? They don't have to use drugs to self-medicate anymore, and they're no longer fearful of going back into drug use. We've worked with cardiac patients, heart patients, who've been deeply hurt by others. You know what happens when they go through a forgiveness process? There's more blood flow through the heart when they think about the incident of being crushed. It actually improved the functioning of their heart. Right? We've worked with emotionally abused women, terminally ill cancer patients. While their physical measures were going down because they were dying, their psychological indicators were going up, including hope for the future. Think about that. They're in hospice. They're dying. They have 6 months to live, and their hope for the future is going up. Why? Because they brought the family to their bedside. They were able to forgive and reconcile, and they knew they were leaving their family in a better state when they were passing. Their hope for the future was going up. Our current research in prisons is starting in the maximum security prison, the tough one. We have our mass murderers and the like. And we're just completing the first 6 months with the experimental group. And we've trained the counselors. We've selected one of my books published by the American Psychological Association called 8 Keys to Forgiveness. And they're once a week, just like Suzanne Friedman, for about an hour at a time. We're collecting our first set of post-test data now. Our case study evidence in prisons is basically this. Those who go through the forgiveness group, many of them go from maximum security, where you have to go through many locked doors to visit them, to medium security. Why? They're no longer as angry. They spend less time in what we call in America restrictive housing, or though we used to call it solitary confinement. Right? And my dear friend Orteal, who passed away just recently, broke my heart. Right? He was in for life. And I quote him all over the world because here's what he had said after forgiveness therapy. Someone was on the hook, and he put me on the hook. And then I put others on the hook. And on the hook was a slang for brutalize. And he realized that someone was brutalized and they brutalized him. And then his brutalizing ended up brutalizing others, and he says no more. And he ended up being quite a good citizen in this maximum security prison. He and I befriended one another, and I was very sad to see him go. All right? He got a lot of insight that forgiveness can help you see that you can be on the hook and put like your children on the hook and the children's children on the hook, and it can go on for hundreds of years. All right? One gentleman said forgiveness therapy has been the only thing that has ever worked for him. Right? There are other positives. We talked about emotional healing. There can be relational healing, as we see in the prisons. They get along better with the officers than with one another. Okay? It can aid the offending person in terms of just their overall well-being. It can promote more peaceful relationships in families and in the prison. It can promote a more peaceful world if we could get forgiveness outside of its confines of just ancient texts, into our mind and heart and discussion. Right? It can fit in more consistently with your particular philosophy or religion. And forgiveness is simply good in and of itself. Why? Because it's a moral virtue. And all moral virtues are good. So how do people forgive? How do we go about doing this? This is our model that we have brought to the cardiac patients, into prisons, incest survivors. We just ended up doing a study of emotional or sexually abused women, actually 12-year-olds in Pakistan. We've been in the 3 largest cities of Iran just recently with teenagers, helping them to walk the forgiveness pathway if they chose. So how do you do it? Well, first of all, we ask the person to come up with an injustice on which they wish to work, or a series of injustices, like the gentleman who is in for life, who is a mass murderer and shot his whole family. He can forgive his father for the years of pattern of making him crawl on his hands and knees. He doesn't have to forgive his father one at a time for the hundreds of these. He can forgive the father for the pattern. If someone is verbally abusive to you over and over, and I see that in families, unfortunately, you can forgive for the pattern. But pick something out that you need to work on that's eating away at your happiness, that is a poison within you, that actually is robbing you of a well-being, and we have a cure for that, and it's called forgiveness. Choose the thing that is eating you alive. Then we have 4 phases. In the first phase, we look at how the resentment is eating away at your happiness. First, we take a look at anger or sadness or disappointment. It's not always anger. I'm using anger here as a filler word, but it's mostly anger. And we look at the depth of that anger, how what happened to you ashamed you. Right? The boy was crawling on his hands and knees with shame. Right? And then we take a look at how anger has affected your health. Do you know what the most frequent health complaint I get as a licensed psychologist and as a researcher? Fatigue. When you carry around all of this unfairness that you have not let loose, it can burden you where you don't have enough energy to get through the day. Hello, caffeine. Okay? You might not need as much stimulants if you forgive. Then we take a look at people who obsess over the injury. I talked with a young man, a college student at my university, whose father used to beat him regularly when he was a child. He's now 21 years old. Every night when he went to bed, he would dream about his father chasing him. Every night he knew what he would dream about. He forgave his father, the dream left. He wasn't obsessing about this. Sometimes we compare ourselves with the other. We say, you know, everyone loves this person. And then behind closed doors, this person is brutal to me. And that comparison can lead to depression. The injury sometimes can cause a permanent change in your life. You might have to leave a job, or a country, or a marriage. And that's unfair, and that adds to your resentment. And then we see one of the most sinister of all developments, effects of resentment, effects of injustice treatment, changing your worldview. And by that I mean, and think about it for yourself, many people become very pessimistic in life. They don't trust anybody. They become embittered, and the glass is always half empty rather than half full. And that is like a rowboat being untethered from the dock and slowly drifting out until one day, a year later, you realize you have a new philosophy of life that is embittering you. And a lot of the time it happens because you have been treated unfairly. All of this is motivation to ask the question, do you want to forgive? And so then we enter phase two, which is the decision to forgive, and it's the person's choice. We don't say, well, now that we've gotten this far, you better forgive. We don't say, well, it's a norm in this society that you forgive. No. We say, do you want to forgive? If not, maybe you have a good jogging program, or a good book club, or a good friend with whom you can talk. You don't have to go down the path of forgiveness. But if you have all of this fatigue, the shame, comparing yourself with others, obsessing over the issue, and a negative worldview, all of which has been caused by the disease of resentment, we can help you if you have decided that you want to think about forgiveness, then go ahead with forgiveness, and if you do, we reiterate the definition. You know what you're getting yourself into. You're going to deliberately try to get rid of the resentment and offer goodness to the one who hurt you. And let's start by doing no harm. That's usually our homework assignment. Are you willing to do no harm to the one who hurt you? That's very heroic. That's transitional for many people. See, we're not saying, like Joseph, embrace your 10 half-brothers. Love, give them abundantly. Give abundantly to the one who hurt you. No, we're talking about refraining from the negative. Just can you commit to do no harm to them? That can make you stronger. Then we enter what we call the work phase of forgiveness. And here we start with thinking because it's easier to think than to feel. And we have 3 exercises that we call personal, global, and cosmic. Personal asks you to do a life review of the other. If you're mugged on the street and don't know the other, you can't do the personal perspective because you don't know anything about them. But most of us have been hurt by family members. And so you know what life was like for the one who hurt you. Most can see. And we ask, how have they been wounded? How have they been, to quote Orteal, how have they been on the hook? How have they suffered? Not to distort, but to understand. Then comes the global perspective. And we say this, do you realize you share a common humanity with the one who hurt you? If you're cut, you bleed. If they're cut, they bleed. You need a little air to breathe, a little land to stand on, a little nourishment. You're both going to die one day. You both have unique DNA where when you die, there'll never be another human being like you ever in the world. When the person who hurt you dies, there'll never be another person like that person ever in the history of the world. You are both special, unique, and irreplaceable. All right? And then we get to the cosmic perspective only if a person has what we call a transcendent or spiritual perspective. Otherwise, we don't go here. If we're dealing with someone with a materialist philosophy, we stay with the personal and global. But if someone has a spiritual perspective, let's say someone has a Jewish perspective, right? You could ask this question of a Jewish person who's undergoing forgiveness interventions. Is it true that you are made in the image and likeness of God? Read Genesis 1. In fact, it's repeated in Genesis 1. You're made in the image and likeness of God. Whoa, it's repeated. So then, drum roll please, when you're doing forgiveness, you ask this. Is it true that the one who has hurt you is made in the image and likeness of God? Whoa. If that's true, and we know you share being special, unique, and being irreplaceable, and you know they have suffered and you have suffered, what happens then to your heart relative to that person? And what we tend to find is the heart starts to soften a little bit, where you're not stony cold to them. And this takes time. The idea of compassion, which is a suffering along with. And so the heart work is showing the person that they're getting rid of the resentment. And only when they start being strengthened by the thinking of who the other is, and they start being strengthened in the heart by the resentment going down a bit, do we ask them to accept the pain or bear the pain? Where did I come up with that one? Morton Kaufman. Have you ever heard of Morton Kaufman? He was an Israeli psychiatrist who was writing in the 1950s, and he didn't do research on forgiveness, but he would work with his clients on the idea of forgiving. And he would ask them to bear the pain so they don't throw their pain onto others and put them on the hook. One of his case studies was of a gentleman in Israel who was a very good soccer player or football player who would come to practice, do great things, and then just walk away. He would subvert the practice. He would get in the face of his teammates. He would disrupt the practice, and it's because he was angry with his father. So Morton Kaufman, the psychiatrist from Israel, asked him to stand up and bear the pain that his father caused him so he doesn't pass the pain on to others. He doesn't put the other on the hook, as Ortiz says. And the gentleman did that, and he was healed, and he was more cooperative in his soccer team. And then we ask to give the gift of forgiveness to the other. Only after you're strong enough here, right? Then comes the ending, the phase 4, where you find new meaning in what you've suffered. Are you familiar with the name Viktor Frankl?
Yes.
Auschwitz?
Yes.
Right? Jewish psychiatrist. He found 2 kinds of people in Auschwitz. Those who found meaning in their suffering and those who didn't. He said those who found meaning lived, those who found no meaning in this died. When he would go in the work camp outside of Auschwitz, he would look up at the mountains and he would see the beauty, and he realized there is beauty in the world despite his suffering. And a good part of his meaning was to stay alive, to be reunited with his wife. Sadly, she died. But you know what he then did? Wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He found meaning in writing book on meaning. And he helped save a lot of lives in what he did. So we ask people, what are you learning from this? We sometimes then discover our need to be forgiven. That's where restorative justice comes in, you see. After those in prison learn to forgive others, now they can say, you know, I think I've brutalized others. I'm ready for an apology, for me to apologize. We realize that we're not alone. We oftentimes have to do this with others. That's what part of restorative justice is like. And then people develop a new purpose in life. Oftentimes it's to become healers of others, not necessarily professionally. But every one of the incest survivors, we were surprised, wanted to become helpers of other incest survivors. And the discovery of the freedom of forgiveness is that resentment that could kill you, it goes away. And the anger goes down, the anxiety goes down, the depression goes down, and our scientific evidence shows it. Our future, we're now working with women in maximum and medium security. We're preparing for a medium security and a maximum security prison with men. And we're working on adolescents in South Korea. What about Israel? Let's have some questions, answers, because we want to keep everything going. They'll never forgive me if I go over my time. Yes.
Yes. Hi. It's a very interesting topic, and thank you for bringing it to us. And I just have one question, because I think you might be missing a certain part of the equation here. And what about the person who wronged you learning an effective lesson? Because when you talk about restorative justice, and even when you talk about the Joseph fable, the whole idea of the trick with the goblet was, and Judah sacrificing himself, was in order to have him recognize that that all the brothers have learned their lesson and were now ready to become better brothers. That's why he forgave them. Not for what they did to him, but for what they did to Benjamin. But it doesn't matter, because they were now ready to be forgiven because they could see the error of their ways. And you talk nothing about it. I mean,
yes. Let me reiterate the question. why don't we hold out our forgiveness until the other shapes up? In other words, I'm saying, I will give you good things only when I care about you enough for you to change. Here's why I disagree with that. You can forgive and still ask that of the person. You don't have to order these exclusively by holding out your forgiveness until the other changes. You can reverse that if you wish. You could do it either way. But many people do hold out the sequence your way. Here's what worries me about that. If someone gains pleasure in brutalizing me, and they know they will never change until, well, they know you as the one who's been hurt, okay? Let's say we're in a really weird relationship where I've hurt you, but you want me to change. And if I'm sadistic, and I know you will not forgive me until I change, I'm not going to change. And now I have double power over you. Not only have I brutalized you, I have now brutalized you again, because you know what? You're not free to seek the freedom of forgiving and getting rid of the poison within you. My thought is, if the poison within you is so hurting you, there's no reason logically that you can't get rid of that and then come to me and hold me to a high standard. Why is it possible that I will only change until I know you will then forgive me? You see. I wonder what you think about that. I don't want to have the last word on it.
Well, I thought you should get the last word because it's your lecture. No, I think it is an interesting point of view. If you view anger as something that's really poisoning you, and it's interesting if you also work with cancer patients, not only with victims of crimes, actually
Right.
also victims of their own tragedy. And,
Yes.
but yeah, that it's something you gave me some food for thought.
Oh, food for thought. Well, good. You have given me food for thought. See, we help each other. Thank you. Yes.
So it's very interesting, and I was wondering, what about self-forgiveness? I mean,
Yes.
after all, when you're gonna commit a crime or hurt somebody, right?
Yes.
You probably will feel something wrong. You will feel blames. So what you gonna do with that? I mean, after you're going to forgive others, you're going to forgive yourself. Or first you're going
What
to forgive
about
yourself, and then
self-forgiveness?
Yeah.
Great point. In fact, when I am in the maximum security prison, and I am part of the group therapy, where I only attend occasionally, some of the men will wait for all the other men to leave, and then they'll look around, and they'll whisper, because you cannot show a lack of strength in the American prison. It could kill you, okay? And they say, I can't live with myself for what I have done. How do I forgive myself? And here's my answer. You can offer moral virtue to yourself. Can't you be fair to yourself? Sure. Can you be kind and patient to yourself? Sure. What does it mean to forgive yourself? It means two things to me. You do exactly to yourself what you did to others, which means taking the personal, global, and cosmic perspectives, softening your heart toward yourself, not because of what you've done, but in spite of it, standing up to the pain so you don't subvert others or yourself because of it. But the only addition, which is different from forgiving others, is you then go to those you have hurt through your actions that have hurt you, that in all likelihood have hurt others, and seek forgiveness from others. So self-forgiveness is to follow the same path we just went through and seeking forgiveness from others. Let's take one more so we can stay on task with time. Yes?
I actually have two short questions. One of them are the differences between people who just let go versus those who internally forgive.
Okay, let's answer that one first. Is there a difference between those who just let it go and those who forgive? You know, when you've been brutalized, there's no such thing as letting it go. I think it's a myth. I think people actually end up with the psychological defense that Sigmund Freud told us, which is repression, suppression, or denial. Because look, when we worked with the incest survivors, many of them had been incested prior to puberty and they were 40, 50 years old. Look at the hospice people who were dying. They were 80, 85 years old, and they had been carrying resentment for 40 years. Yes, we can let things go when it's mild, but when we've been crushed by life, there's no such thing as just letting it go. And then you had another question?
Can you apply to, on a national level,
Can you apply forgiving on a national level? Well, we work in Belfast, Northern Ireland. We work in Liberia, Africa. That's emerging from a civil war where 250,000 people were killed. We have forgiveness education in Galilee and in Bethlehem, and we're making inroads because of Peter Pellich of the Elijah Interfaith Institute into Jerusalem. And so it seems to be that it is possible that if you could get groups of people together, like Women Wage Peace, as an example, in Jerusalem and all of Israel, and get them to take that seriously, that kind of voice, that kind of tenacity could change situations. I'm not naive enough to say 100% that would happen, but we need to bring it to the national level. And so your challenge, I think, is a beautiful one, and it's a good place for us to end. Thanks.